Good evening and welcome. Our debate this evening between Democratic candidate Barbara Mikulski and Republican candidate Linda Chavez is co-sponsored by the Selinger School of Business and Management of Loyola College and the Maryland League of Women Voters. And joining us now is the League President, Betsy Cullen.
Good evening. On behalf of the League of Women Voters in Maryland and Loyola College, I welcome you. We hope that the next hour will help you make a choice, an informed choice, on November 4th. The League sponsors debates like this because we believe that an active and informed citizenry makes democracy work. Making democracy work is in fact the theme of a League of Women Voters education project entitled Agenda for Security, Election 86, of which this debate is a part. Funding for this project is provided by the W. Alton Jones Foundation of Charlottesville, Virginia, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. The League of Women Voters does not support or oppose candidates for political office. Neither the League nor the college accepts responsibility for the views expressed by the candidates tonight. It's up to you to listen, to reflect on their views, and to vote on November 4th. Now on with the debate. Vince?
Thank you very much, Betsy. The rules for tonight's debate are these. Each candidate will begin with 1 minute for an opening statement, 2 minutes for closing statements. The question and answer portion of the debate will allow each candidate to answer the question posed by one of our panelists, respond to a follow-up question, and then have 1 minute of rebuttal time each. Right now, let's meet the people who will be asking the questions tonight. We begin with, on my immediate right, Dorothy Brunson, who is president of radio station WEBB. On her right, Ernest B. Pat Ferguson, who is the chief of the Washington Bureau of the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and Dr. Hans Mayer, who is the associate professor of political science here at Loyola College. Thank you all for being here tonight. Now, as agreed previously, and again, fair warning to our candidates tonight concerning time restrictions. We have an official timer from the League of Women Voters with us tonight and an official bell. And when your time is up, you will hear that bell and we will move on immediately. And of course, you will each be given time cues as your time counts down. Now, let's start with our opening statements of 1 minute each. Positioning was determined earlier by a toss of a coin. And we'll begin with Democratic candidate, 5-term Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski.
Thanks to the League and Channel 11 for sponsoring this debate. Being on this campus is like coming home. Mount St. Agnes, where I graduated, is now part of Loyola, and this is where I taught for a number of years. Back then, I never dreamt I would have the privilege of being a Congresswoman or the honor of running for the United States Senate. The question before Maryland is, what kind of senator do we need? You know me and the kind of senator I'll be. One who cares about the great issues, but sees them in human terms and never forgets the people at home. For example, trade is an important international issue, but it's also a domestic issue, a family issue. The steelworker who loses his job to unfair trade practices knows the impact on his family and knows that I will fight for fair trade practices for his family and for jobs here at home. I'll be an independent voice for Maryland. Give me the opportunity to be your next United States Senator, and together we'll tackle the issues facing our family, our country, and the world.
Barbara Mikulski. Next is Republican candidate, a former assistant to President Reagan, Linda Chavez.
Thank you, Vince. For 10 years, Barbara Mikulski has represented the 3rd Congressional District of Maryland, and now she wants Marylanders to elect her to a 6-year Senate term. The question that begs answering tonight is whether Ms. Mikulski has acted in the interests of her constituents and promoted their welfare. And no single episode in her term in Congress raises more questions about Ms. Mikulski's suitability to be a United States Senator than her hiring a woman 5 years ago who, according to the Evening Sun, used Representative Mikulski's congressional office to promote what one staff member called fascist feminism and others described as Marxist and anti-male. Ms. Mikulski herself said of this woman's social philosophy that it had, quote, her complete support and had become a blueprint for her congressional work. Is this radical vision which Ms. Mikulski espoused still her vision for Maryland and the country? And is this what Marylanders can expect from my opponent
Thank you,
if she
Linda
is elected
Chavez.
senator?
I'm sorry, we now know what the bell is tonight. We'll begin our questioning now. We go first to Dorothy Brunson for the first question.
My question relates to the budget. Reducing the federal budget deficit and controlling federal spending is touted by some as almost an impossible task. Even with presidential line veto, which Ms. Chavez advocates, and or congressional oversight and analysis, which Ms. Mikulski advocates. Given this complex budgeting process that brings along haggling that may shut down and has shut down the government from time to time, and with the Senate being able to tack on special interest bills, especially, ladies, if you were to get into the Senate, what would you do to balance the budget under these conditions, and how would you give the public a balanced budget when the Senate can add in excess of over $100 million of special interest amendments?
All right, and the first answer will come from Barbara Mikulski.
Well, Dorothy, that is probably one of the most difficult issues facing the Congress. And the way I've addressed it is to try to take essentially a business-like approach. The first thing you do when you're running a deficit is think about liquidating your assets. That's why I'm very proud of the role that I played in the selling of Conrail. I felt that the United States had no business being in the long-term running of a railroad, and then I helped put together the transaction in my Energy and Commerce Committee to sell Conrail, to do it in through the private sector, and to get $2 billion, which we've targeted to deficit reduction. The other thing that I've worked on is to try to do a programmatic analysis to get rid of those issues or those things that are wasteful and lavish. I voted against a $10 billion synfuel program. I voted to get rid of the Clinch Breeder River nuclear reactor, which would not give us new energy nor new solutions, again, in the billion-dollar range. And then I looked at small programs. For example, I chaired the Oceanography Committee in Congress, and I felt it was my responsibility to look that budget over with my green eye shade and sharp pencil out, and I cut $40 million from a small budget, but I saved the taxpayer $40 million by getting rid of things like paid advisory boards and paid trips to Washington, and yet at the same time preserve some of the important environmental programs that are facing our country. I also was an advocate in Congress.
I'm sorry, thank you.
I'll catch you in the rebuttal.
Ms. Mikulski. Same question, a detailed question on what to do to balance the federal budget from Linda Chavez now.
Well, the federal government ought not to be in the business of running airports in Virginia. It ought not to be in the business of running railroads. It ought not to be in the business of running utility companies in Tennessee. All of those items have been proposed for sale or lease by the president in his budget, and they would, in fact, bring in certain revenues and eliminate certain spending from our federal budget. But beyond that, I think every single program in the budget should be looked at, and no program should be immune, including defense. But I would not vote to cut needed programs for defense, as Ms. Mikulski has in her 10 years in Congress. Rather, I would look to better strategic planning, going to a 2-year budgeting process to try and keep spending down in that way. And I would also look at some of our social spending programs, such things as our aid to families with dependent children, to try and move that program from one that simply keeps people dependent on federal government welfare, leaving children a hopeless future, and rather turn it into a program that moves people off the welfare rolls and into paying jobs so that they become taxpayers, not revenue users.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. First answers to the first question. Dorothy, you may now follow up question with each of the candidates, beginning with Ms. Mikulski.
Ms. Mikulski, since we are sitting here at Loyola, and you mentioned wasteful spending, are you aware that within the budget that 75% of all research goes to universities and is concentrated in the area of defense? Would you be willing to cut such an item as that?
Well, I think what I've been a strong advocate of is research and development, both in the civilian sector as well as in in defense. I think that when one is talking about cutting research in the area of defense, I think one needs to say, well, what is it that we're doing? And that goes then to a strategic analysis. The question becomes is, what enemies are we trying to defend ourselves against? That then means if we go to the Soviet Union, I happen to believe in an alternative triad to President Reagan's. Stealth bomber, for example, I think is far a superior weapon to the B-1. I support research and development for that. But then if we're talking about research and development for tanks that don't tank and subs that don't sub and missiles that don't fly, the answer is no. I think we have to take out our red pencil and take a look at it.
All right, Dorothy, a follow-up to Ms. Chavez.
Ms. Chavez, you mentioned specifically social programs, aid to dependent children. Are you familiar that in almost all of the programs, including the WIN program, which gets welfare recipients off of welfare and put them in jobs, almost all of the social programs that would help to aid welfare recipients and other low to moderate income persons were cut practically 50% in this budget. And yet we had defense in terms of McDonnell Douglas and other city and state programs of special interest to Senate persons being added on. How would you account for that?
Well, first of all, defense in the state of Maryland is not just national security. Defense in the state of Maryland is also bread and butter. The defense industry in Maryland is one of our biggest employers, with some of the largest employers in the state, including Westinghouse, responsible for defense research. Much of the non-federal government, non-state or local government employment in our state is in one way or another related to defense. So when you're talking about defense in the state of Maryland, you're talking about jobs for people. You're talking about people who earn salaries and pay taxes. The cuts in social spending that you discussed, I think could be discussed further. Frankly, I don't see it as a guns or butter issue, certainly not in the state of Maryland.
All right, as agreed now, each candidate will have 1 minute each to rebut the other, beginning with Barbara Mikulski this time.
Dorothy, I hope that during the course of this debate we talk about not only the budget deficit, but the three others facing our country: the trade deficit, the R&D deficit, particularly in the civilian area, and also the education deficit. But earlier in my first set of remarks, I talked about wise procurement. Now, I've been part of the congressional effort to have wise procurement in defense, but I've also taken a look at those issues related to social spending. That's why I've been in the forefront in Congress related to hospital cost containment programs, where we were able to place disciplines on our health programs where we could exercise fiscal responsibility and yet social responsibility at the same time. I'm pleased that I helped preserve Maryland's hospital cost containment waiver that cut money, provided health care, but at the same time exempted us from the Reagan DRG approach, which we know has resulted in often premature discharges of people. So I believe we not only should look at defense, but the social area as well.
Ms. Mikulski, and now Ms. Chavez, you have 1 minute to rebut your opponent.
My opponent said that she favored the stealth airplane as opposed to the B-1 as if it were an either-or proposal. As a matter of fact, we need both of those weapons, and we need also to be able to improve the quality of our intercontinental ballistic missile system. But Barbara Mikulski, regardless of whether it was a Trident submarine or whether it was the MX missile or the B-1 bomber, the Midget Man, or a rapid deployment force, has, over the course of her years in Congress at various points, voted against defense spending. Defense spending that I believe the majority of Marylanders support. They support a strong national defense to keep our country safe and secure. They support President Reagan's modernization of our military forces.
All right, now the next question will come from Pat Ferguson of the Baltimore Sun.
Some of the most emotionally debated issues in modern politics have been proposed in the last few years in the form of constitutional amendments on which the senators have to vote. They include amendments to ban abortions, to ban school busing for integration, to allow prayer in public schools, and the Equal Rights Amendment. I'd like to ask each of you first to give me a simple yes or no on how you'd vote on each of those. I'll go down the list and then discuss yours and your opponent's positions. Ms. Mikulski.
Excuse me, the first response will come from Ms. Chavez to reverse the order.
Fine, in that order, yes. First, abortion.
I would not vote for a constitutional ban on abortion.
To ban school busing for integration.
I believe there are alternatives to a constitutional amendment. I am opposed to forced busing.
How would you vote on the amendment?
If it were the only alternative, I would vote for it.
Prayer in public schools.
I would vote against allowing prayer in public school.
The Equal Rights Amendment.
I would not vote for it.
Ms. Mikulski, to ban abortion.
I would vote against the constitutional amendment to reverse Roe versus Wade.
To ban school busing for integration.
I would vote against that constitutional amendment.
To allow prayer in public schools.
Prayer is already allowed, Ernie, but...
organized prayer, you know what the amendment is.
I would vote against that constitutional amendment.
The Equal Rights Amendment.
I voted for it already.
All right, Mr. Ferguson, you may now follow up, beginning with Ms. Chavez, please.
Would you explain your position on those, and if you take issue on with any of your opponents?
Well, I'm very much in favor of equal rights for women. I think that equal opportunity in our society and the civil rights laws that were passed in the 1960s have been very important in opening up doors to people who'd had those doors closed before. I believe that our Constitution currently includes women under a reading of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which bans states from enacting laws that discriminate. I believe that the civil rights laws of the 1960s guarantee women equal opportunity in employment, that we have laws that guarantee women equal opportunity in education, and we have laws that guarantee equal pay for equal work. Those are the things that I believe in, and I don't believe that we know how an Equal Rights Amendment, as it is currently drafted, would be interpreted, and even those who propose the bill suggest that it would have to be interpreted by the Supreme Court. I would rather not leave it up to the Supreme Court.
And now a follow-up question to Ms. Mikulski.
Almost enough states have ratified the ERA for it to become an amendment, although it seems to have stopped short just before getting to its goal. But it's going to be with us, apparently. If it doesn't succeed by that method, it's going to rise up again. Will you explain why you're strongly for it?
I support the Equal Rights Amendment, first as a constitutional amendment, because I believe a constitutional amendment should be used to expand democracy. I oppose the others that you outlined, Ernie, because the Constitution is a sound document, and the amendments were not meant to be tinker toys to be just played with or attached to the Constitution. In terms of the Equal Rights Amendment, we do not believe that the article, the 14th Amendment, adequately does cover women. That yes, we do have laws on the books, but one law at a time just doesn't do it. So what the Equal Rights Amendment would do would be to give women the full, adequate, unequivocal, irrevocable protection of the Constitution of the United States. And I think it's needed, and I think it's important.
We now come to rebuttal time. Ms. Chavez, you have 1 minute.
What many people who are critics of the Equal Rights Amendment suggest is that the ERA, as it is currently drafted, would require women to serve in combat positions in military, would subject women to the draft, would take away laws that now protect women, such laws that protect women in their childbearing responsibilities. It also, many people believe, would open up the whole question of homosexual marriage. I don't know that we know what the effects of the Equal Rights Amendment as currently drafted would be, but I am certainly not willing to turn that responsibility over to 9 people who sit on the Supreme Court. If such a document is going to be drafted, it had better be drafted in ways that are clear and not open to the kind of interpretation that may come down 20 and 30 years from now and may end up harming women more than helping them. Our Constitution doesn't mention men or women. Only individuals or persons, and all persons are guaranteed equal rights under that Constitution.
Ms. Mikulski, you now have 1 minute.
Well, the Equal Rights Amendment, as drafted by both the House and the Senate and passed both bodies, really gave women the adequate protection that was needed. For those who raised those questions about what the negative impact would be of ERA, we do have experience. There are states who have passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Our own state of Maryland is one. All of the folly and that my opponent has raised in this debate is demonstrated by the fact that none of that occurred in Maryland under the Equal Rights Amendment. And in fact, it strengthened the economic security of women. It puts teeth in the enforcement of equal pay for equal work. And as we can see in Maryland, no woman was forced to serve in the National Guard. No woman was given up the protections that she enjoyed before the state ERA is passed. And in fact, we would see that women's lives have been better in Maryland for it, and we would like to take the Maryland experience and expand it to the other 49 states.
All right, our next question comes from Dr. Hans Mayer of Loyola University.
You both hope to inherit the seat currently held by Senator Mathias, who has called President Reagan's decision to hang tough on SDI at Reykjavik a mistake. Could I have your thoughts?
The first answer from Barbara Mikulski.
Well, Professor, no American ever would want to second guess an American president when that American president is sitting across from the Soviet Union. And I agree with President Reagan when he said, no deal is better than a bad deal. But I'm sorry that we did not reach a tentative framework for either arms control or arms reduction that would be mutual and verifiable at Iceland. However, I do believe that the President wants arms control. I intend to work and support the President in his pursuit of arms control. However, I think it should be a bipartisan issue. I do not think that the pursuit of peace, arms control or arms reduction, should be turned into a political football during this election year. I'm happy to say that when President Reagan comes before us to ask for help, I will do what I can to work with him. But I'm also skeptical of some of the components that were discussed at Reykjavik. I'm skeptical of the SDI system in terms of providing us the protection that it's touted to do. I'm skeptical that some of the proposals being made would have made Western Europe quite vulnerable in the fact that it would have left us only to have conventional forces available. So I think we have to do a lot more talking and a lot more negotiating. But arms control and arms reduction will be a priority of mine in the United States Senate.
Same question now to you, Ms. Chavez, with regard to SDI and the Iceland summit. Was there an error made?
Well, first of all, I sometimes listen to my opponent in this general election, and I think there's somebody out there impersonating Barbara Mikulski, because the week before the president went to Iceland, there were in fact 4 votes taken that affected those negotiations, and Barbara Mikulski voted to tie the president's hands in those negotiations. She has been an opponent of SDI. I support SDI. I support SDI for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that we ought to be looking towards defense. The Soviet Union has been involved in strategic defense for nearly 2 decades. They have a ground-based system. We have the technology to base that system in space. We're protecting ourselves with SDI not just against a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, but also from the kind of accidents that the Soviet Union has been involved in recently, with submarines sinking, nuclear-powered submarines sinking, with Chernobyl exploding and killing people. I'd like to see SDI there, not just to protect us in terms of the Soviet Union, but to protect us from those countries and those madmen like Muammar Gaddafi, who may someday get a bomb. I would like to think that we will have the technology to make sure that an accidental war does not happen and that accidentally people do not die because we do not have adequate protection.
Dr. Mayer, a follow-up question now to Barbara Mikulski.
What could prompt the Russians to consider SDI not solely and exclusively defensive, but partly at least offensive?
Well, I think what the Soviets are afraid of is that a system, a computer technology system in space to deflect nuclear weapons or decoys could also be targeted about them in an offensive way. I think to give the Soviets some assurance in that area, they have the assurance of our own President Reagan, who's invited them to observe our research, to observe our, particularly our testing, and to observe our deployment if we ever reach that. But I think that the Soviets' argument against being concerned about being offensive is a weak argument, because after all, who would be most likely to launch a first strike but the Soviets themselves? They don't want SDI because they don't want a spending race. Their economy is in shambles. Their philosophy is proven to be bankrupt. Because of the tremendous expansion, they can't afford a massive research.
Thank you, Ms. Mikulski. And a follow-up question now, Dr. Mayer, to Ms. Chavez.
A fully developed system, the way you describe it, would certainly cost a pretty penny. In fact, former Secretaries of Defense Schlesinger and Harold Brown estimate, and neither of them a San Francisco-style liberal, estimate that it would be something in the neighborhood of $1 trillion. Since this would necessarily have to come out of the defense budget, what specific programs would you cut to accommodate SDI, or are you dreaming revenue enhancement?
Well, first of all, as you know, SDI is being taken in stages. There's now research going on, testing of various components of the SDI system, and only later deployment. This is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. The point is, in terms of the negotiations at Reykjavik, that I find myself very suspicious when the Soviet Union is so interested in stopping our research and our testing from going forward. Sometimes we hear skepticism from American scientists about whether or not SDI will work. Soviet scientists, I can assure you, have no such skepticism, or Mikhail Gorbachev would not have risked as much as he did in order to try and get the president to abandon SDI. I see no reason why we should not take our technology where it can take us, and particularly when it is aimed at defending rather than building weapons of destruction.
Now we come to rebuttal time on this question of strategic defense initiative and the recent Iceland summit. Ms. Mikulski, you may go first.
Professor, let me explain to you and the ladies and gentlemen listening here why I'm skeptical of SDI. I'm skeptical for 3 reasons. One, scientists really doubt its technological feasibility. Second, it will not be ready until the next century, even if it's done, allowing the Soviets time to overtake it. And in addition to that, it lulls us into a false sense of security. The SDI that's being proposed is not a leak-proof astrodome over the United States of America. It is a vulnerable missile system. First of all, it's vulnerable to being shot down by the Soviets. Second, in terms of its technical feasibility, we know that it is an idea that does not exist, but is trying to be born and requires enormous scientific breakthroughs. One of the things it would require right now would be 600 space shuttle launch, 600 launchings in space within the next 3 years to even test some of the computer activity. We don't think it will work. It also does not...
Thank you, Ms. Mikulski. And now, Ms. Chavez, you have 1 minute for your rebuttal.
Barbara Mikulski may not think SDI works, but the Soviet Union does. She says she's skeptical about SDI, and she acts as if there are alternative methods of defense that she would support. And yet, I don't care whether you're talking about a new missile system to be able to make our ICBM force comparable to that of the Soviet Union's, or whether you're talking about a new strategic bomber or a submarine. No matter what the defense system, Barbara Mikulski can be shown to have voted against those programs. In fact, she voted for one of the most radical cuts in defense spending ever proposed, the Congressional Black Caucus's budget, which would have cut $240 billion over 3 years, would have eliminated such things as the Rapid Deployment Force. These are the kinds of views Barbara Mikulski has on defense. They are not the views that Marylanders have.
Next question from Dorothy Brunson, and the first answer will come from Ms. Chavez. Dorothy.
Okay. Back to the budget again. We talk about social programs and as a problem within the budget, but no one seems to focus on the borrowing by the federal government. And I want to just throw some figures. In 1981, $7 billion was borrowed. 1985, $141 billion. There is no surplus left over in these last few years to reinvest in order to create income to offset the budget. How do you see increased borrowing, and how do you see us limiting that borrowing so that we can not pay in excess of 20% or more of our budget to debt?
The only way that you can limit to the borrowing that is necessary is by spending less, and that is precisely what has been proposed over the last several years of this administration. Unless the United States Congress decides to live within its means, it will continuously be forced to borrow, and it will continuously be forced to pay interest on that debt. I believe that it is the responsibility of each and every member elected to the United States Congress to exercise judgment. That's why I did not favor the Graham-Rudman approach to deficit reduction. I don't believe that you put spending cuts on automatic pilot and allow a formula to take the place of the individual judgment of people who've been elected to office. I believe that that is the only way that we're going to move away from borrowing and live within our means, just as any person would who is living on a family budget. All of us strive to live within our means. We've all been taught from our earliest years not to live beyond those means, and I think the federal government could learn something from the kind of family budget that Marylanders have to deal with.
Same question to you, Ms. Mikulski. How do you see the increase in borrowing, and how do you limit borrowing not to increase the debt?
Well, one of the things that I did was voting. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I've done since I do have a 10-year record of public service I'm proud of. I voted against the 1981 tax cut because I felt the 1981 tax cut would add to our deficit, that we would hemorrhage revenues from the federal treasury and do very little to help middle-income people be able to have more money in their checkbooks. And of course, I think that vote proved to be a very wise one. We have seen that as a direct result of the 1981 tax cut, we've added $1 trillion to our debt over a 5-year period. Prior to that, it took us almost 195 years, including 2 world wars and a Vietnam War, and we didn't add up to $1 trillion debt. That 1981 tax cut really had a very destructive impact in terms of the budget. But I also believe in other revenue enhancements. That's why I do support the concept of looking at liquidating the assets that government doesn't have to be in, whether it was the sale of Conrail, the transfer of Dulles and National to a Virginia authority, things along those lines, and also to beef up the enforcement of internal revenue. You know, right now, because the cuts among internal revenue enforcers, we've lost a great deal of money. If we could have those IRS people on the job, for example, in collecting the taxes lost by tax dodgers, it's estimated we could add a couple billion.
Again, our time is up, and I implore you candidates. You may now follow up your question, Dorothy, beginning with Ms. Chavez.
Ms. Chavez, you proposed spending less, and one of the proposed legislation's limitations in terms of borrowing is the fact that more privatization to take place at the local government level and also at the federal level. Yet the incentive for businesses to be able to go into services as tax-exempt bonds and other kinds of support systems to have incentives to be in partnership with the government are being lessened by the current bill. How do you see spending less? Give me some specifics.
Well, I have given you some specifics. I talked about the sale of assets. I was talking about that long before I heard Barbara Mikulski talking about it in this campaign. I think that when you start talking about such things as the 1981 tax cut, it's good to remind people that that tax cut meant a 25% cut in federal taxes for each and every Marylander. Barbara Mikulski voted for this year's tax reform bill, which did in fact reduce tax rates. I assume she did so because she knows, as she should have known in 1981, that when you reduce the amount of taxes that people are spending, you allow them to spend their own money. That promotes growth in our economy, and it allows jobs to be created in the private sector, where they can be much more efficiently run than they can in the public sector.
And a follow-up question to Barbara Mikulski.
One of the concerns of the business community within the greater metro Baltimore area is the sales of Dulles and National to Virginia, and the fact that this will cause a hardship on BWI. The caveat was that we received $72 million to improve BWI, but we still believe in the long term that this sale is going to jeopardize the growth of BWI. Under those conditions, do you still think that's a favorable sale to help reduce the budget?
Well, I think we got the best deal that we could, Ms. Brunson. I must say that Secretary Dole, in her liquidating of assets, proposed her method of sales, whether it was to Conrail or whether it was to giving the airport actually away to Virginia, would have hurt Maryland. In the sale of Conrail, for example, we could have lost rail service to our port. I helped detour and derail that sale, saving us there. In terms of the transfer of Dulles and National, I think what we did was bring the money back to Maryland that will make us more competitive. The increased money for runways, modernization, will help us continue to be a gateway airport for international travel. It will also serve to provide us with the resources necessary to keep Piedmont here. And as you know from your own work in the private sector, the linkage with the South, particularly Piedmont Airlines and the Henson commuter flights, are what fueled the growth of the BWI, as well as the investments made by Governor Hughes. So I think we got a good deal.
Thank you, Ms. Mikulski. And now rebuttal time, first from Linda Chavez.
I think it's important that we hear more about Barbara Mikulski's record on both spending and on taxes. Barbara Mikulski has not been an advocate of lower taxes because she believes that government knows better how to spend your money than you do. She has also never met a spending bill, at least in the domestic area, that she didn't like, unless it's the National Endowment for Democracy, which is one of her favorite targets for cutting in the federal budget. You can't have it both ways. If you want to have a balanced budget, you're going to end up having to cut spending or you're going to have to raise taxes. I would prefer to see us act responsibly and to live within our means and to reduce federal government spending and not to raise people's hard-earned dollars by taxing them at higher levels and raising the amount of taxes so that Barbara Mikulski can decide how to spend your money.
Ms. Chavez. And now 1 minute of rebuttal time from you, Ms. Mikulski.
If the 1981 tax bill was so terrific, why did I hear so many complaints from Marylanders about the fact that they were paying too much in taxes, and also that they felt our tax system was unfair? The 1981 tax bill never really put more money into Marylanders' checkbooks. And of course, it did not deal with the issue of fairness. That's why I did support the 1986 tax bill, because I thought it was good for families, good for business, and good for Maryland. This was a family-oriented tax bill because it increased personal exemptions. It enabled people to keep special deductions, like for their mortgage, and we did not tax fringe benefits. And we also provided funds for research and development, important to a expanding economy. But in terms of spending, sure, I've spent money for the federal government, but I've made public investments that generated private sector jobs, and I'm very proud of that. That's why last night I brought home over $170 million after 10 years of fighting to dredge the Baltimore Harbor.
All right, let us continue with our questioning and our senatorial debate tonight. Let me implore our panel to be as brief as possible in your question, and perhaps, if possible, to narrow the scope of your question. Next question from Pat Ferguson of the Baltimore Sun, and it will be to Ms. Mikulski.
You both aspire to replace Senator Mac Mathias, who's been described as a great civil rights senator. But your records are very different on civil rights. Ms. Mikulski, with a long record of voting in Congress, very similar to Mr. Mathias's, and Ms. Chavez, having been with the commission that has tried to change many of the civil rights policies of the last 20 years. Respond to this, if you will, in this way. Ms. Mikulski, first, tell me what you think is wrong with your opponent's civil rights record, and then I ask you to do the opposite.
Well, I've made it a special point during this campaign not to be critical of my opponent in terms of any aspects, though I must say I've taken a couple of 1-2 punches in that direction. And tonight's a perfect example of that. But I think rather than me saying what's wrong with my opponent's civil rights record, I would like to talk about what the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, said about the way she managed the Civil Rights Commission. They really said that she mismanaged the Civil Rights Commission, said that she hired outside consultants inappropriately, that she did not pay attention to the civil service requirement systems, and at the same time that there was certain vouchers and other things unaccounted for. So I would say that the Government Accounting Office, looking at the way that she managed the Civil Rights Commission when she's executive director, gave her a D.
Same question to you, Ms. Chavez. What do you see is wrong with your opponent's civil rights record?
I think that the whole struggle in civil rights through the 1960s was to guarantee that people be judged on their own merit, to be able to guarantee that no matter what your skin color was, your gender was, your religion was, that you were judged on how hard you worked and what effort you put in, and whether or not you were qualified. During the 1970s, and in part because of the responsibility of people in the Democratic Party, we saw a move away from that in certain civil rights organizations. They moved towards programs that would grant preference on the basis of race, racial quotas, insisting that children be bused away from the school nearest their home in order to attend a school across town in order to try and promote racial balance. What we saw as a result of those programs was a mass defection from public schools in our inner cities, leaving those schools more segregated than they began. Barbara Mikulski has voted for forced busing. She's voted for racial preference. She's voted for the very term racial quotas in programs in education. I don't believe in those things because I don't believe that was the history of the civil rights movement. It is certainly not what I marched along picket lines when I was a teenage girl fighting discrimination. It is not what I believe most Americans believe in when they talk about equal opportunity.
Pat Ferguson, your follow-up question to Barbara Mikulski.
This is not a direct follow-up, but considering that there are just barely 2 weeks left in the campaign, this may be the last best opportunity for each of you to tell us if you think that your opponent in this campaign at any time tonight or previously has used unfair tactics of any kind, has distorted the record in any way. Ms. Mikulski.
Well, Arnie, I've spent this campaign as I've spent the 20 years that I spent either as a community activist, a city councilwoman, or as a congresswoman, not focusing on the opposition, but focusing on the people I hope to represent. I really haven't paid much attention to what my opponent has said. I paid a lot more attention to the people of Maryland, to listen to their needs, listen to their concerns, and try to see how we could take those day-to-day concerns and make them into national policy. I've listened to the concerns of young families. Moms and dads be worried about daycare. They saw that as a family issue. Talking to Maryland business, they're also concerned about daycare. They see it as an issue of productivity. That's why in Congress, as in the past, I hope to try to make sure that daycare is available, accessible, and affordable. So you see, I spend my time listening to Maryland and not to those TV ads.
A follow-up question now to Linda Chavez.
Would you comment on how you think your opponents run her campaign, if there's been any unfair tactics or distortion of the record?
Well, I think that Barbara Mikulski is absolutely right. She hasn't paid much attention to her opponent. In fact, she's tried to build a reputation as a fighter, and yet this is only the second time we've been in the ring in the course of this entire general election. She's turned down every opportunity to be with me, whether it was on television or before an audience of Marylanders who have the right to choose which of us. There have been some other things that have happened in this campaign. She claims not to have any part of this, but neither has she condemned it. Questions have been raised about my mixed faith religion, religious marriage to my husband. I don't know whether or not that was directly at the direction of Barbara Mikulski or her staff, but certainly when she was attacked by an outside group who spent thousands of dollars to attack her in what I considered unfair ads, I spoke out against that. I condemned those efforts. I asked that they be stopped. I've heard no word of her condemnation of this kind of religious intolerance that's been directed at me.
Rebuttal time now, 1 minute each from the candidates, beginning with Barbara Mikulski.
This is the fourth time I've appeared with my opponent in terms of a public debate, two during the primary, one at the Baltimore Council of Foreign Relations and the other at the Maryland Association of Counties. Then the other last week we were at Channel 7, and here we are tonight. We were both scheduled to be before the AARP, but I had to be in Congress and she had to be with President Reagan. Perhaps there'll be other forums in which we could get together. But I'd also like to make another comment. My career in public service has been devoted to expanding democracy, expanding opportunity, and to ending discrimination. Yes, I have voted for important civil rights legislation, and I'm very proud of those votes. That's why I think that when it comes to replacing Mac Mathias, I most like him. I most like him on arms control. I most might like him on civil rights. I most like him on championing the Bay and working to clean that up. I think when Maryland is trying to decide who do they want to be their next senator and who's most like Senator Mathias, I think the record will prove that's Barb Mikulski.
Thank you, Ms. Mikulski. Rebuttal time from Linda Chavez.
Well, maybe it'd be best to ask Mac Mathias who he thinks would better carry on his legacy in the United States Senate. He articulated his views on that issue this week. In a letter he sent, he co-hosted the luncheon for the president on my behalf, and he has endorsed my candidacy. So I think if we're going to talk about Mac Mathias, he's the best person to speak for Mac Mathias, not Barbara Mikulski. I believe very strongly in equal rights for all individuals in our society, and I think they ought to be protected. I don't think that that means in order to overcome discrimination against one group that we inflict different forms of discrimination on different groups. I'm in favor of equal opportunity. I'm opposed to preference on the basis of race or gender or religion. Those are the things that were meant by the civil rights laws of the 1960s, and I fully endorse them. I don't endorse quotas.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. Now, in order to accommodate the amount of time we have left, and in the interest of fairness to each of the candidates, and to allow them time to adequately get in their closing remarks, we'll have one final question. It will come from Dr. Hans Mayer, and it will be, the answer will be each be 1 minute and 30 seconds, the same question to each. Dr. Mayer?
How would a proven involvement of the United States in the ill-fated flight of Eugene Hasenfuss affect your support of the current policy, or for the current policy of the U.S. government?
The first answer, please, from Linda Chavez.
Well, first of all, I do support the President's and the Congress's now voted military and economic aid to those who are fighting against a communist regime in Nicaragua. That regime is a threat to its own people. It violates the human rights of its people. It also attempts to export revolution throughout Central America, and I think that that is against the strategic interests of the United States. Now, we have no proof right now that Mr. Hassenfuss was acting in any official capacity. I don't believe, frankly, that individuals, private citizens, should engage in private wars against any country. We have laws that prohibit that. I oppose that. I think I would prefer that he be tried here under a system of justice that I believe in, not a system of justice as a mockery of justice as they have in Nicaragua. But obviously I am not in favor of private citizens going out and engaging as soldiers of fortune in order to promote their idea of right and wrong. The Congress voted money to go to rebel forces who are opposing the Sandinistas. I support that, as does the President, as does now a majority of the United States Congress, even though my opponent has been opposed to that.
Same question now to Barbara Mikulski. The effect of the flight of Eugene Hassenfuss on America's policy in Central America.
Well, I accept President Reagan at his word when he says that we were not involved. I do know that my colleague in Congress, Mr. Michael Barnes, chairs the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere's activity, and we'll be holding extensive hearings to just see what that involvement was. But to take a minute and talk about our policy in Central America, I do differ from President Reagan in his approach. I oppose aid to the Contras. I think that is a war by proxy in Central America. Essentially what we are doing is funding the very Somoza people that were guilty of human rights violations within Nicaragua. But I think we need a regional strategy and a country-by-country plan to resolve the issues in Central America, and I would advocate the use of the Contadora process, which would call for the withdrawal of all military troops, all military advisors, bring in a verification commission, and then deal with it that way. And right now, in terms of El Salvador, they need earthquake aid, and I was very pleased, however, to see that our own government has responded very directly in that area. But you know, Central America is probably is so important to us, but what we need to focus on is the expansion of a middle class, the expansion of democracy, and the demilitarization of the region. That's the policies I think we should follow.
A final opportunity now for direct rebuttal on the subject of America's policy in Central America, and each candidate will get a minute and 15 seconds if we can handle that timekeeper. Rebuttal coming, please, first from Linda Chavez.
Well, first of all, Barbara Mikulski not only opposes aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, she's also voted against aid for the government of El Salvador, the democratically elected government of El Salvador, also struggling against rebel forces that threaten that fragile democracy. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, there was only one democracy in Central America, and that was Costa Rica's. Since Ronald Reagan has been president, and since we have been giving aid to those countries, we've seen Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador have democratic elections. Now it's time to see that that democracy expands also to the people of Nicaragua, who were betrayed by the Sandinista revolution. Barbara Mikulski says she supports Contadora. It was the Sandinistas that walked away from the Contadora process. I believe that we should be aiding people. I don't care what color their skin is, if they're brown or black or white. If people want to be free and live under a democratic form of government, we ought to be helping them. And I believe that the only way that we're going to do that is to provide economic assistance, and in terms of Nicaragua, provide military assistance as well to the Contras who are fighting.
And rebuttal time from Barbara Mikulski on this issue, 1 minute, 15 seconds.
Throughout this debate, my opponent has distorted my record by only speaking in half-truths. And a perfect example in this is when she says that I voted against aid to El Salvador. I voted at times for aid, and I have voted against aid. Let me tell you about when I voted against aid to El Salvador. It's when we were trying to investigate the death of the nuns, trying to bring an end to the death squads, and trying to move Duarte to renouncing his ties to the military regime that brought such brutality. When I voted for aid, I wanted to be sure that we had the requirements that he would take provable, positive steps to end brutality in his own country, to bring the assassins of the nuns to justice. And yes, I did vote against aid until he was willing to cooperate with the United States of America in ending a civil war in his own country, moving to free elections, and honoring ordinary standards of human rights. But you know, there are other issues in south of the border. Probably one of the biggest challenges facing us is Mexico. Mexico is trying to export two of her major problems to us. She has a terrible economic problem, and she's trying to deal with that, or turns the other way, by exporting the illegal aliens to the United States. I'm glad we passed a tough immigration bill.
Thank you, Ms. Mikulski. That concludes our question and answer portion of our debate tonight. Now it is time for closing statements. Each candidate will have 2 minutes, and as determined by an earlier coin toss, Barbara Mikulski will begin.
A United States Senator really has two jobs: to work on the immediate needs of Maryland and to look ahead to the long-range needs of America and the world. The Senate offers a chance not simply to observe great events, but to shape them. It's not enough, for example, just to talk about the importance of freedom. We have to be willing to stand up for human rights, whether in Poland or Afghanistan, whether the victim is a Russian dissident or a teenager murdered in Chile. It's not enough to say you care about Maryland's future. You have to understand both Capitol Hill and the counties. You have to be willing to shape strategy and sweat the details. That's the way to get the Baltimore Harbor dredged, and that's the way to bring new jobs and opportunity to Maryland. A senator has to understand the larger picture, to approach problems with a sense of history as well as a sense of the moment. In South Africa, the question isn't just what will happen tomorrow. The fact is that soon, someday soon, South Africa will be free, and this time America should be on the right side of history. Most of all, I intend to be an independent voice in the Senate. That's what Paul Sarbanes is. That's what Mac Mathias has been. Like them, I hope to speak for both the concerns and conscience of Maryland. Like them, I hope to strive to be a senator who unites people, not divides them. In closing, let me say this: how remarkable and how wonderfully American it is that Linda Chavez and I are on this stage and in this Senate race. Both of us have had lifetimes of opportunity, and I want to see the doors of opportunity open for all of our people. More than 15 years ago, when I started public life, I didn't dream I would be in this position today. The challenges and the horizons have broadened for me and for all of us. Yet I believe the values are the same. The belief that we can make a difference, that we can build a better life, and our first priority of people is people. That's the kind of person I am. That's the kind of senator I'll be for you and for all of Maryland.
And now a closing statement from Linda Chavez.
I want to thank Barbara Mikulski for appearing with me tonight. This has been the second time that we have appeared together, and unless Barbara Mikulski changes her mind, it will be the last opportunity that the voters of Maryland have a chance to listen to us and listen to our views side by side, to listen to our